The morning sun cast long shadows across the small village of Millbrook, where old Thomas sat on his wooden porch, his weathered hands trembling as they gripped his walking stick. At 72 years old, his body had grown frail, but his eyes still held the same fierce pride they had carried for decades. Those eyes now watched the dirt road leading away from their modest home. Waiting for a sight he had dreamed of for 30 years, Thomas had been a soldier once, strong and capable, serving his country with honor during the great conflicts of his youth. But an injury during his service had cut short his military career before he could achieve his greatest ambition, to stand guard at the royal palace. The royal guards were the elite, chosen from thousands, trained beyond measure, entrusted with protecting the crown itself. Thomas had come close, so very close, but fate had other plans for him. He returned to Millbrook with a limp that never quite healed, a chest full of medals that meant the world to him, and a heart heavy with unfulfilled dreams. He married Sarah, a kind woman with gentle hands and a patient smile. And together, they built a life that was simple but filled with love. When their son Marcus was born on a cold winter night, Thomas held the tiny bundle in his arms and made a silent wish. He would never force his dreams upon his child, but somewhere deep inside, he hoped Marcus grew up listening to his father's stories. Every evening, after dinner, Thomas would sit by the fireplace and tell tales of his time in service. He spoke of the discipline, the brotherhood, the sense of purpose that came from serving something greater than oneself. Marcus would sit cross-legged on the floor, his young eyes wide with wonder, absorbing every word. Sarah would watch them from her chair, knitting quietly, a small smile playing on her lips. The boy showed promise early on. He was strong for his age, quick to learn, and possessed a natural sense of duty that seemed to run in his blood. When he was 10, Marcus asked his father to teach him to march. Thomas, despite his bad leg, stood tall and showed his son the proper way to carry himself. They practiced in the backyard, the old man calling out commands, while the young boy tried his best to meet the standards his father set. Years passed, and Marcus grew into a fine young man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with his father's determined eyes and his mother's kind heart. When he turned 18, he sat his parents down at the kitchen table one evening. The lamplight flickered across their faces as Marcus took a deep breath and announced his decision. He wanted to join the military. He wanted to serve. He wanted to try for the Royal Guard. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He looked at his son, this young man who had grown so quickly, and saw both hope and fear reflected in those earnest eyes. Sarah reached over and squeezed her husband's hand under the table. Thomas knew what his wife was thinking. The military was dangerous. The path to becoming a Royal Guard was even more so. Many tried and few succeeded. The training was brutal, designed to break all but the strongest in body and spirit. But Thomas also saw something else in his son's face that evening. He saw a determination that couldn't be taught or given. It had to come from within, from a place of genuine calling. Marcus wasn't doing this to please his father or to fulfill someone else's dream. This was his own choice, born from years of listening to stories and understanding what service truly meant. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone on the porch again. The stars were bright overhead. The village was quiet, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of leaves in the wind. He thought about his own youth, his own dreams, and the injury that had ended them. He thought about the years of wondering what might have been. And now his son wanted to walk that same path, to chase that same impossible dream. Sarah came out and sat beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool night air. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there in the comfortable silence they had built over decades of marriage. Finally, she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're afraid," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm afraid he'll fail and be heartbroken. I'm afraid he'll succeed and I'll lose him to a life of duty that leaves little room for family. I'm afraid of what the training will do to him, how it might change the kind boy we raised. But most of all, Sarah, I'm afraid I put this dream in his head, and now he's chasing it for me rather than for himself." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm despite the cool air. "That boy in there has made his own choices since he was old enough to walk. You know that. He's stubborn like you, but he's got his own mind. If he says this is what he wants, then we have to trust him. And we have to support him no matter what comes." Thomas looked at his wife, this woman who had stood by him through everything, and nodded. She was right, as she so often was. Marcus had chosen his path. Now it was Thomas's job to be the father his son needed, not the man reliving his youth through his child's ambitions. The next morning, Marcus began preparing for the recruitment process. Thomas helped him train, pushing him harder than he had ever pushed before, but always with love and wisdom guiding his words. They ran together each dawn, Thomas riding an old bicycle beside his son as Marcus built his endurance. They practiced drills in the backyard. Thomas taught Marcus everything he remembered from his own service, every lesson learned, every trick that might give his son an edge. The day finally came when Marcus had to leave for basic training. The whole village gathered to see him off at the bus stop. Thomas stood tall, his uniform from decades ago pressed and clean, worn one last time for this occasion. He pinned one of his own medals on Marcus's chest, a tradition passed from father to son. As the bus pulled away, Thomas saluted, his arms straight and true despite the years. Marcus returned the salute from the window, and then he was gone, disappearing down the road toward a future unknown. The first few months were the hardest. Marcus wrote home whenever he could, his letters arriving in worn envelopes that Sarah would open with trembling fingers. Thomas would read them aloud by the fireplace, just as he had once told his stories to young Marcus. The letters spoke of grueling physical training, of drill sergeants who seemed to never sleep, of exhaustion so deep that Marcus would fall asleep before his head even hit the pillow. But there was something else in those letters, too. There was excitement. There was purpose. Marcus wrote about the friends he was making, young men and women from all corners of the country who had come together with the same goal. He wrote about learning to work as a unit, to trust the person beside him with his life. He wrote about the satisfaction of completing a challenge he had thought impossible. Just days before, Thomas read every word carefully, sometimes reading the same letter multiple times, searching for signs of his son's well-being. He could see Marcus growing through the words on the page, becoming stronger, more confident, more capable. Sarah would listen and smile, occasionally wiping away a tear when she thought Thomas wasn't looking. She missed their son terribly, missed his laughter, filling the house, missed setting a place for him at the dinner table. The village followed Marcus's progress with great interest. Millbrook was a small place where everyone knew everyone else, and they were proud that one of their own was making such an effort. Old Mr. Peterson, who ran the general store, kept every letter Marcus sent posted on his bulletin board. The baker's wife, Mrs. Chen, would ask Sarah for updates every time she saw her. The blacksmith's son, who had been Marcus's childhood friend, spoke of joining up himself after seeing Marcus's determination. 6 months into his training, Marcus came home for a brief leave. Thomas and Sarah waited at the bus stop, arriving an hour early in their eagerness. When Marcus finally stepped off that bus, Thomas barely recognized him. The boy who had left was gone, replaced by a man who stood taller, moved with purpose, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and when he embraced his parents, Thomas felt the strength in his son's arms. That evening, the whole village organized a gathering in Marcus's honor. Tables were set up in the town square, and everyone brought food to share. Marcus sat, surrounded by familiar faces, answering questions about his training, his experiences, his plans for the future. Thomas watched from nearby, pride swelling in his chest so much it almost hurt. Later that night, after the celebration had wound down and the villagers had returned to their homes, Marcus and Thomas sat together on their old porch. The same stars that had watched over them for years still shone overhead. Marcus spoke about his training in more detail than he had in his letters. He talked about the moments of doubt, the times he had wanted to quit, the mornings when his body screamed at him to give up. "What kept you going?" Thomas asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a long moment, looking out into the darkness. "I remembered the stories you told me," he said finally. "About duty, about honor, about being part of something bigger than yourself. But it was more than that, Dad. I remembered how you never complained about your injury, never spoke with bitterness about the dreams you couldn't achieve. You taught me that real strength isn't just physical. It's about getting up every day and doing what needs to be done, even when it's hard. Thomas felt his eyes grow wet, but he didn't wipe away the tears. He reached over and gripped his son's shoulder, a gesture that said more than words ever could. They sat like that for a while, father and son, connected by blood and by a shared understanding of what it meant to serve. The leave ended too quickly. Such precious times always do. Marcus had to return to complete his training. The next phase would be even harder, he explained. Those who wanted to try for the Royal Guard had to go through additional selection processes. Out of the hundreds who had started basic training with him, only about 20 had qualified to even attempt the Royal Guard trials. The odds were daunting. But Marcus's jaw was set with determination. Thomas helped his son pack his belongings the night before he had to leave. As they folded clothes and organized equipment, Thomas pulled out a small leather pouch from his drawer. Inside was a worn photograph of himself in uniform, young and proud, standing at attention. On the back, he had written a message years ago, something he had always kept private. "I want you to have this," Thomas said, handing it to Marcus. "But don't read what I wrote on the back until you really need it. You'll know when that time comes." Marcus took the photograph carefully, studying his father's young face. He could see the resemblance, the same determined set to the jaw, the same steady gaze. He tucked it carefully into his pocket and nodded. The next morning's goodbye was harder than the first one had been. Sarah cried openly this time, not caring who saw. Thomas stood firm, his hand raised in salute as the bus pulled away once more. But after it disappeared from view, he sat down heavily on the bench at the bus stop, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. "He'll make it," Sarah said softly, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "I know he will." Thomas wanted to believe her, but he knew the statistics. The Royal Guard accepted perhaps 1 or 2 candidates each year, sometimes none at all. The trials were designed to find not just the strongest or the fastest, but those with the perfect combination of physical ability, mental toughness, integrity, and dedication. Marcus would be competing against the best of the best. Young men and women who had trained their entire lives for this opportunity. Weeks turned into months. The letters became less frequent. When they did arrive, they were shorter, Marcus's handwriting more rushed. The trials had begun, he wrote. Every day brought new challenges, new tests of his abilities. He couldn't share many details as much of the selection process was confidential. But he wanted them to know he was giving everything he had. Thomas developed a routine during this time. Every morning he would wake before dawn and walk to the edge of the village, to a small hill that overlooked the valley. He would stand there in the growing light, his bad leg aching from the climb, and he would think of his son. He would remember his own youth, his own time in service. And he would send silent prayers or wishes or whatever one called the hopes of a father's heart out into the universe, Sarah. Worried about her husband during these months? He grew quieter, more introspective. He spent hours polishing his old medals, reading through his service records, looking at photographs from a lifetime ago. She understood that he was living through Marcus's journey in his own way, experiencing both the joy of seeing his son pursue such a noble goal and the pain of his own unrealized dreams. Winter came to Millbrook with its usual quiet beauty. Snow covered the village in a blanket of white, and smoke rose from chimneys as families gathered inside their warm homes. Thomas and Sarah celebrated the holidays quietly, setting a place for Marcus at the table, even though he couldn't be there. The empty chair served as both a reminder of his absence and a symbol of their hope. For his success, it was on a cold January morning, nearly 18 months after Marcus had first left home, that the telegram arrived. The delivery boy knocked on their door just after breakfast, his cheeks red from the cold. Sarah signed for it with shaking hands, and Thomas stood frozen in the doorway. Afraid of what news the thin envelope might contain, they opened it together, Sarah's fingers gripping Thomas's arm tightly as he unfolded the paper. The message was brief and formal, written in the official language of military communications. Marcus had completed the final stage of the Royal Guard selection process. Out of the hundreds who had tried, out of the 20 who had been deemed worthy to attempt the trials. Marcus was one of only 2 who had been selected. He would begin his specialized training immediately, and if he completed it successfully, he would be formally inducted into the Royal Guard in 6 months. Sarah let out a cry of joy and relief, her hands flying to her mouth. Thomas read the telegram 3 more times, making sure his old eyes weren't deceiving him. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his weathered face, and tears began to stream down his cheeks. His son had done it. Marcus had achieved what Thomas himself had always dreamed of, but never reached. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By afternoon, neighbors were stopping by to offer their congratulations. Mr. Peterson closed his store early to come, shake Thomas's hand. Mrs. Chen arrived with fresh pastries, her own eyes damp with happy tears. The blacksmith, a gruff man who rarely showed emotion, clapped Thomas on the back so hard it nearly knocked him over, then apologized profusely while grinning broadly. That evening, Thomas sat alone in Marcus's old room. The space had remained largely unchanged since his son had left, still decorated with the interests and dreams of the boy Marcus had been. Thomas ran his hands over the books on the shelf, the awards from school, the childhood toys that neither he nor Sarah had been able to pack away. He remembered teaching Marcus to tie his shoes in this room, helping him with homework at the small desk by the window, talking about life and dreams and the future. Now that future was unfolding in ways that seemed almost too good to be true. His son would be a royal guard, one of the chosen few who stood watch over the crown and the palace. It was an honor beyond measure, a position that would mark Marcus as exceptional for the rest of his life. Thomas felt joy for his son's success, pride in all that Marcus had accomplished through his own determination and hard work. But underneath that joy, Thomas felt something else stirring. It was a complex emotion, hard to name or understand. Part of it was envy, not bitter, but honest. The natural feeling of a man who had wanted something desperately and never achieved it. Part of it was fear, worry about the dangers his son would face in such a position. And part of it was a strange sense of closure, as if a circle that had been left open for 30 years was finally being completed. Just not in the way he had imagined. Sarah found him there an hour later, sitting on Marcus's bed in the gathering darkness. She turned on the light and sat beside him, her presence a comfort as it had always been. "You're thinking too much," she said gently. "I can always tell when you're overthinking things. You get this furrow between your eyebrows." Thomas smiled slightly and reached up to touch his forehead. "Am I allowed to feel complicated things about this?" he asked. "I'm so proud of Marcus I could burst. But I also feel, I don't know, Sarah, like I'm mourning something even while I'm celebrating." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You're mourning the dream you never got to fulfill yourself. That's natural, Thomas. You're human. You can be happy for Marcus and sad for yourself at the same time. These feelings don't cancel each other out." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands in their son's empty room. Outside, the winter night was clear and cold, stars bright in the dark sky. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "I need to tell you something I've never said out loud before," he began, his voice quiet. "When my injury happened, when I knew I would never make the Royal Guard, I was devastated. But what really broke me wasn't just losing the dream. It was feeling like I had failed, like I wasn't good enough. Like I would always be the man who almost made it but didn't. I carried that for years. Sarah, sometimes I still carry it." Sarah squeezed his hand tighter. "You've never failed at anything that truly mattered," she said firmly. "You've been a good husband, a wonderful father, a respected member of this community. Those things are worth more than any uniform or title." Thomas looked at his wife, this woman who had loved him through everything, and felt a weight begin to lift from his chest. "Marcus succeeding doesn't make up for my failure," he said slowly, working through the thoughts as he spoke them. "But maybe it shows me that I didn't fail at the most important thing. I raised a son who was brave and strong and dedicated. I gave him a foundation to build his own dreams on. That's something I did accomplish, even if I didn't accomplish everything I wanted." The next months passed in a blur of anticipation. Marcus's letters during his specialized Royal Guard training were rare and brief, but each one was treasured. He wrote about learning ancient protocols, about studying the history and traditions of the Guard that stretched back centuries, about physical training that made his earlier preparation look simple by comparison. He wrote about being measured for his formal uniform, about learning to stand watch in the specific way that royal guards had stood for generations. Spring came to Millbrook, melting the snow and bringing new life to the fields and forests around the village. Thomas spent more time outdoors, walking the paths he had walked his entire life, seeing them with new eyes. He was aware, perhaps for the first time truly aware, that he had built a good life here. Not the life he had planned, not the life he had dreamed of as a young soldier, but a life that had meaning and value nonetheless. One warm afternoon, Sarah called Thomas to the door. Another telegram had arrived. This one was even briefer than the last, but the words seemed to glow on the page. Marcus had completed his training successfully. The formal induction ceremony for the new royal guards would take place in exactly 1 month. Family members were invited to attend. They should prepare to travel to the capital city. Thomas had never been to the capital city, though he had dreamed of it during his youth. The journey took most of a day by train, the countryside rolling past the window in shades of green and gold. Sarah sat beside him, dressed in her finest clothes, a navy dress she had owned for years but rarely had occasion to wear. Thomas wore his old uniform, carefully cleaned and pressed, the medals pinned precisely where regulations required them to be. His hands trembled slightly as the train drew closer to their destination. The capital was larger, and more magnificent than Thomas had imagined. Buildings rose high into the sky, their windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Streets bustled with people from all walks of life, more people than lived in 10 villages like Millbrook. Automobiles and buses moved in steady streams, and the air hummed with the energy of the city. A military escort met them at the train station. A young officer who introduced himself politely and helped them with their simple luggage. He guided them through the busy streets to a hotel near the palace where families of the new royal guards were being accommodated. The room was nicer than anything Thomas and Sarah had ever experienced, with a soft bed, running hot water, and a view of the city that took their breath away. That evening, they were invited to a small reception where they could briefly see Marcus before the ceremony. The room was filled with other families, all dressed in their best, all wearing similar expressions of pride and nervous excitement. Thomas stood near the door, his bad leg aching from the journey, his eyes scanning the crowd for his son. When Marcus entered the room, Thomas barely recognized him. He wore a simple military uniform, not yet the formal regalia of the royal guard. But he carried himself with such confidence and grace that he seemed to command attention without saying a word. His eyes found his parents immediately, and his face broke into a wide smile that reminded Thomas of the boy Marcus had once been. They embraced tightly, Sarah crying happy tears into Marcus's shoulder, Thomas gripping his son hard enough to make his arms ache. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus looked at his father with eyes that held both joy and concern. "Are you okay, Dad?" he asked quietly. "I know this must be hard for you in some ways." Thomas was surprised by the question, surprised that his son had understood the complexity of his feelings. He took a moment to consider his answer carefully. "I am so proud of you," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly proud. You've achieved something remarkable, Marcus, something that most people only dream about. And you did it through your own hard work, your own dedication. I hope you know that." Marcus nodded, his eyes growing damp. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. The foundation you gave me, the values you taught me, the example you set. When things got really hard during the trials, when I wanted to quit, I would think about you, about how you never let your injury stop you from being a good man, a good father, a person of honor. That gave me the strength to keep going." They talked for nearly an hour, sharing stories and catching up on lost time. Marcus told them about the other new guards who would be inducted with him, about the months of intense preparation, about the responsibility he felt taking on this role. He spoke with maturity and thoughtfulness that made Thomas realize his boy had truly become a man. Sarah, it's the questions only a mother would think to ask. Was he eating enough? Was he getting enough sleep? Had he made friends? Did he have everything he needed? Marcus answered patiently, assuring her he was well cared for, that the royal guard looked after its members in every way. The reception ended too soon, and Marcus had to return to his quarters for final preparations. He embraced his parents once more, holding them close and whispering his love for them. Then he was gone, swept away by the currents of duty and protocol that would govern much of his life from now on. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood by the hotel window, looking out at the city lights, at the distant silhouette of the royal palace where tomorrow's ceremony would take place. Sarah slept peacefully in the bed behind him, exhausted from the emotions and excitement of the day. Thomas was alone with his thoughts, and they swirled like leaves in an autumn wind. He thought about the young soldier he had been, so eager and determined, so sure he would make his mark on the world in a particular way. He thought about the injury that had ended those dreams, about the long months of recovery and the longer years of learning to live with disappointment. He thought about returning to Millbrook, about meeting Sarah, about building a life that was different from what he had planned. He thought about Marcus's childhood, about all the evenings spent telling stories by the fireplace, about teaching his son to march in their backyard, about watching him grow from a curious boy into a determined young man. Had he pushed Marcus toward this path? Had he somehow transferred his unfulfilled dreams onto his son's shoulders? Thomas wrestled with these questions until the early hours of the morning. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, he reached a kind of peace. Marcus had made his own choices. Yes, Thomas's stories and example had influenced him, but influence was not the same as force. Marcus had pursued this dream because it resonated with something inside himself, because it aligned with his own values and desires. The fact that it happened to fulfill Thomas's old wish was a beautiful coincidence. But it wasn't the driving force behind Marcus's success. More than that, Thomas realized something else. His life hadn't been a failure just because he hadn't achieved one particular goal. He had been a good soldier for the years he served. He had been a loving husband for decades. He had raised a son who embodied the values of honor, duty, and service. He had been a respected member of his community, someone people turned to for wisdom and guidance. These things mattered. These things counted. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, as if the weather itself was celebrating. Thomas and Sarah dressed carefully, helping each other with buttons and clasps, neither trusting their nervous fingers to work properly alone. A car arrived to take them to the palace, and as they drove through the gates, Thomas felt his heart begin to pound. The palace was even more magnificent up close. Its ancient stones spoke of centuries of history, of kings and queens who had ruled, of countless men and women who had served with distinction. The gardens were immaculately maintained, every bush perfectly trimmed, every flower bed a masterpiece of color and design. Guards stood at attention at regular intervals, their uniforms crisp, their bearing perfect. They were shown to their seats in a grand hall where the ceremony would take place. The room was breathtaking, with high ceilings decorated with intricate artwork, tall windows that let in streams of golden sunlight, and row upon row of polished wooden chairs. Other families were already seated. Thomas and Sarah found their places toward the front, where they had a clear view of the raised platform where the ceremony would occur. The hall filled slowly with distinguished guests. Thomas recognized some faces from television and newspapers, high-ranking military officers, government officials, members of the nobility. All had come to witness the induction of the newest royal guards, an event that only occurred when candidates proved themselves worthy of the honor. Sometimes years would pass between ceremonies. The rarity of the occasion only emphasized its importance. A military orchestra sat to one side of the platform, their instruments gleaming. As the appointed hour approached, they began to play soft, formal music that echoed through the grand space. Thomas felt Sarah's hand find his, and they held on to each other tightly. Drawing strength from their connection, a door at the back of the hall opened, and everyone rose to their feet. A procession entered, current royal guards in their full ceremonial uniforms, which were unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. The uniforms were deep crimson with gold braiding perfectly fitted, decorated with medals and insignia that spoke of traditions stretching back centuries. The guards moved with synchronized precision, their boots striking the floor in perfect unison, their bearing proud and solemn. Behind the guards walked military dignitaries and palace officials, each wearing their own formal attire, each adding to the weight and ceremony of the moment. Finally, at the end of the procession, walked the two new candidates, Marcus and a young woman about his age, both wearing simple white ceremonial tunics that marked them as initiates. Thomas's breath caught in his chest when he saw his son. Marcus looked straight ahead, his face composed and serious, but as he passed their row, his eyes flicked briefly to his parents. In that instant, Thomas saw love and gratitude and determination in his son's gaze, and he felt tears begin to slide down his cheeks. The procession reached the platform, and everyone arranged themselves according to precise protocol. The candidates stood at the center, facing the audience, while the royal guards formed a semicircle behind them. A distinguished officer, the captain of the royal guard, stepped forward to address the assembly. His voice was strong and clear, carrying easily through the hall without need for amplification. He spoke of the history of the royal guard, of their sacred duty to protect the crown and serve the nation, of the qualities required to wear the uniform. He spoke of loyalty, courage, integrity, and sacrifice. He spoke of the long tradition of excellence that every new guard inherited and was expected to uphold. Thomas listened to every word, his old soldier's heart responding to the language of service and duty. He thought about his own oath of service, taken so many years ago in a much simpler ceremony. He thought about what those words had meant to him then, and what they meant now. He thought about the weight of carrying such responsibility, the honor and the burden that came together. The captain then called Marcus forward first. Marcus stepped up, his movements precise, and stood at attention before the captain. From a velvet cushion, an aide produced a medal, the official insignia of the royal guard, as the captain pinned it to Marcus's tunic. He spoke words that had been spoken to countless guards before him. "Do you swear to protect the crown with your life? To uphold the laws and traditions of this nation, to serve with honor and integrity, and to place duty above all personal considerations?" Marcus's voice rang out strong and clear. "I do so swear." "Do you promise to maintain the standards of the royal guard? To be worthy of the trust placed in you, and to conduct yourself in all matters as befits this sacred position?" "I do so promise." The captain extended his hand and Marcus shook it firmly. Then, as tradition dictated, each handshake represented acceptance, welcome, and the transfer of tradition from one generation to the next. The same ceremony was performed for the young woman, and then both new guards were presented with their formal uniforms. An aide escorted them to a private chamber where they would change, leaving the audience to wait in anticipation when Marcus returned. Thomas had to grip the arms of his chair to keep from standing up in awe. His son wore the full regalia of a royal guard, and the transformation was complete. The crimson uniform fit perfectly, tailored precisely to Marcus's frame. The gold braiding caught the light, and the medals and insignia marked him as one of the elite. But more than the uniform, it was the way Marcus carried himself that struck Thomas. His son stood taller, moved with absolute confidence, and radiated a sense of purpose and authority that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he represented. The two new guards took their positions with their brothers and sisters in arms, and the captain made a final address. He spoke to them directly now, reminding them of the responsibility they had accepted, of the expectations placed upon them, of the honor they brought to their families and their nation. He spoke of the trust that the people placed in them and the price of failing that. Trust. Then came a moment Thomas had not expected. The captain announced that family members were invited to come forward for a private blessing and acknowledgement. Other families began to rise and make their way to the platform, and Sarah tugged gently at Thomas's sleeve. "Hey, come on," she whispered. "It's our turn." Thomas stood on shaking legs, his bad leg protesting after sitting for so long, made his way forward with Sarah at his side. They climbed the steps to the platform, and suddenly Marcus was there before them. No longer as their son in this formal setting, but as a royal guard being honored by his family, the captain addressed Thomas directly, apparently having been briefed on his background. "Sir, I understand you served with distinction in your youth, and that you too once aspired to stand among the royal guard." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The captain continued, "Then you understand better than most what your son has achieved and what sacrifices he will make in service to this duty. The Royal Guard honors your service and thanks you for raising a man worthy of joining our ranks." The captain gestured, and an aide brought forward a medal, smaller and simpler than the one Marcus wore, but no less meaningful. "This is the Medal of Honored Family," the captain explained. "It is given to the parents or guardians of new royal guards, in recognition of their role in shaping the character of those we welcome into our brotherhood. Please accept it with our gratitude." Thomas stood frozen as the captain pinned the medal to his old uniform. He had never expected this, had never dreamed that his own service and sacrifice would be acknowledged in this way. Tears flowed freely now, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. Sarah was crying too, her hands pressed to her mouth, overwhelmed by the moment. Then Marcus stepped forward, breaking protocol in a way that made the captain smile slightly. He embraced his father not as a royal guard but as a son. And Thomas held him tightly, this man who had once been a baby in his arms, who had grown up listening to stories by the fireplace, who had chased a dream and made it real. "Thank you, Dad," Marcus whispered into his father's ear, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for everything. For the stories, for the training, for believing in me, even when I doubted myself. For showing me what it means to serve with honor, even when the path doesn't go the way you planned. I carry your legacy with me not as a burden but as a gift." Thomas pulled back slightly to look at his son's face, seeing both the boy he had raised and the man he had become. "You've made this old soldier prouder than he ever thought possible," Thomas said, his voice rough with tears. "Not because you became a royal guard, Marcus, but because you became a man of character and integrity. The uniform is just a symbol of what was already inside you." Sarah joined the embrace, and for a moment the three of them stood there on that grand platform, oblivious to the watching crowd, connected by bonds of love that ran deeper than duty or honor or tradition. They were simply a family celebrating a moment of profound joy together when they finally separated. Marcus embraced his mother, who whispered her own words of love and pride into his ear. Then, with visible reluctance, Marcus stepped back and returned to his position among the royal guards. The formal ceremony resumed, but something had shifted. The rigid formality had been touched by genuine human emotion, and everyone present had witnessed something beautiful. The ceremony concluded with traditional military honors. The orchestra played the national anthem, and everyone stood at attention, hands over hearts. Then the royal guards, including Marcus, performed a precision drill that demonstrated their training and coordination. They moved as one unit, their movements sharp and exact, their bearing perfect. Thomas watched with the eyes of someone who understood the years of practice required to achieve such synchronization. After the formal ceremony ended, there was a reception in the palace gardens. The guests mingled under ancient trees, servants circulated with refreshments, and the atmosphere relaxed from rigid formality into something more celebratory. Thomas and Sarah stayed close together, somewhat overwhelmed by the grandeur and the distinguished company. But happy to be there, Marcus found them after a while. Having been delayed by official requirements and congratulations from various dignitaries, he brought them glasses of cool lemonade and guided them to a quieter corner of the garden where they could talk more privately. "Tell me about home," Marcus said, settling onto a stone bench beside his parents. "Tell me about Millbrook, about the neighbors, about the ordinary things I've missed." So Sarah told him about Mrs. Chen's latest batch of pastries, about Mr. Peterson finally getting new inventory for his store, about the blacksmith's son who had indeed decided to enlist after seeing Marcus's example. She told him about the spring flowers that had bloomed in their garden, about the new calf born on the Miller farm, about all the small but meaningful events that made up daily life in their village. Marcus listened with genuine interest, and Thomas realized his son needed this connection to home, to the simple life he had left behind. The palace and the uniform and the ceremony were all magnificent, but they weren't the whole of Marcus's identity. He was still the boy from Millbrook, still connected to his roots, and those roots would keep him grounded in the years ahead. As the afternoon wore on, other royal guards came by to meet Marcus's parents. They spoke respectfully to Thomas about his service, asked Sarah about life in Millbrook, and made the older couple feel welcomed and valued. Thomas was struck by the camaraderie among the guards, by the genuine brotherhood that extended beyond ranks and backgrounds. He could see that Marcus had found not just a position, but a family, a group of individuals bound together by shared purpose and mutual trust. The sun was beginning to set when the reception finally ended. Marcus walked his parents back to their hotel, savoring these last precious hours with them. They would have to return to Millbrook the next day, and he would begin his first official duties as a royal guard. The separation this time felt different somehow, heavier with meaning, but also more settled. As if they had all crossed a threshold together, at the hotel entrance they lingered, reluctant to say goodbye. Marcus straightened his uniform, a gesture Thomas recognized his nervous habit, and cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, looking at his father. "Do you remember that photograph you gave me? The one with the message on the back that you told me not to read until I really needed it?" Thomas nodded, remembering that moment the night before Marcus had left for the Royal Guard trials. "I read it during the final selection," Marcus continued. "There was a moment when I was so exhausted, so pushed beyond what I thought I could endure, that I was ready to quit. I was sitting in my bunk trying to find a reason to keep going, and I remembered that photograph. I pulled it out and finally turned it over to read what you had written." Marcus reached into his uniform and pulled out the worn photograph, carefully protected in a plastic sleeve. He turned it over so his parents could see the back. In Thomas's handwriting, faded but still legible, were the words he had written 30 years ago when his own dreams had ended. "To whoever reads this in the future," the message said, "I did not achieve what I set out to do, but I gave everything I had to the attempt. There is honor in trying, even when we fall short. There is dignity in serving, even when the service takes a different form than we imagined. I hope that my life will matter in ways I cannot yet see. I hope that my efforts will mean something, even if they don't lead where I plan to go. And I hope that someday someone will understand that falling short of one dream doesn't mean failing at life. Keep going. Stay true. Serve with honor. That is enough." Thomas stared at the words, barely remembering writing them, but recognizing the pain and hope that had motivated them. He had written them for himself, a way of processing his disappointment and finding a path forward. He had never imagined that 30 years later his son would read them at a moment of crisis. "Those words saved me, Dad," Marcus said quietly. "They reminded me that courage isn't about never struggling or doubting. It's about keeping going despite the struggle, despite the doubt. You taught me that, not just with words, but with your whole life. You showed me what it means to serve with honor, even when circumstances prevent you from serving in the exact way you hoped. That lesson was more valuable than any training I received." Thomas felt something break open inside his chest, some knot of old pain and regret that he had carried for 3 decades. His dream hadn't died when his injury ended his career. It had transformed, taking on new life through his son, but also through his own example, his own way of living with grace and purpose despite disappointment. He didn't fail. "Son," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "and neither did I. We both succeeded, just in different ways than we originally planned. You succeeded by becoming a royal guard through your own merit and determination. I succeeded by raising a son who embodies everything the Royal Guard stands for. We both served. We both mattered." They embraced one final time, and then Marcus stepped back, saluting his father with crisp, military precision. Thomas returned the salute, his arms steady and true, his back straight, despite his bad leg, his heart full of pride and peace. Sarah kissed her son's cheek, straightened his collar one more time in that way mothers do, and whispered her love. Then Marcus was walking away, his crimson uniform catching the last rays of the setting sun, his stride confident and purposeful. Thomas and Sarah stood watching until he turned a corner and disappeared from sight. They stood there a moment longer, hands clasped. 2 people who had built a life together and raised a son who made them proud. The journey back to Millbrook the next day seemed shorter somehow, though it covered the same distance. Thomas spent much of it looking out the window, watching the countryside roll past, thinking about all that had happened. The Medal of Honored Family was pinned carefully inside his jacket, close to his heart, alongside his own service medals. When they arrived home, the entire village was waiting at the bus stop. Someone had telegraphed ahead with news of Marcus's success, and Millbrook had turned out to celebrate. Mr. Peterson had closed his store. Mrs. Chen had baked enough pastries to feed everyone. The blacksmith had crafted a special plaque to commemorate Marcus's achievement, which would hang in the town square. But the celebration wasn't just about Marcus, Thomas realized. It was also about him and Sarah. It's about a family from their small village achieving something remarkable. It's about dreams and dedication, and the power of passing values from one generation to the next. The villagers gathered around, asking questions, offering congratulations, sharing in the joy of the moment. That evening, after the impromptu celebration had wound down and the neighbors had returned to their homes, Thomas and Sarah sat on their porch once more. The familiar stars shone overhead, the same stars that had watched over them through all the years of their lives. Everything was the same, yet everything had changed. "Do you feel different?" Sarah asked, rocking gently in her chair. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I feel lighter," he said, finally. "Like I've been carrying a weight I didn't fully realize was there, and now it's gone. I spent 30 years thinking of myself as someone who had failed, who had fallen short, who hadn't achieved his dreams. But I see now that I was wrong. I did achieve my dreams, just not in the way I expected. I served with honor. I built a good life. I raised a son who went further than I ever could. That's not failure. That's success." Sarah reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture repeated countless times over their decades together. "I'm glad you can see that now," she said softly. "I've been trying to tell you that for years, but I think you needed to arrive at the understanding yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of their village at night. A dog barked in the distance. Wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere, a door closed. These ordinary sounds had been the soundtrack of their lives, and Thomas realized he wouldn't trade them for anything. Over the following months, Thomas found a new peace within himself. He continued his daily routines, but something fundamental had shifted in how he viewed his life. He started writing down his memories, not just of his military service, but of his entire life. Wanting to preserve the stories and lessons for Marcus, and perhaps someday for grandchildren, he helped neighbors more actively, offering his experience and wisdom to young people in the village who were trying to find their own paths. Marcus wrote regularly from the capital, his letters filled with details of his new life. He stood watch at the palace gates, participated in ceremonial functions, and continued training to maintain the high standards of the royal guard. But he also wrote about the deeper aspects of his service, the pride he felt in being part of something larger than himself, the weight of responsibility, and the satisfaction of doing his duty well. Once every few months, Marcus received leave and would return to Millbrook for brief visits. The whole village would turn out to see him in his uniform. He would spend his time catching up with old friends, helping his parents around the house, and simply being home. During these visits, father and son would sit on the porch together, talking about life and service and the paths they had both walked. On one such visit, during a warm summer evening, Marcus told his father about an encounter he had had at the palace. A young soldier had approached him, nervous and eager, asking for advice about applying to the royal guard. Marcus had told him about the training, the trials, and the dedication required. But he had also told him about his father, about a man who had served with honor even though circumstances had prevented him from achieving his highest ambition. About how real success was measured not by titles or positions but by character and integrity. "The young man asked me who the real hero was," Marcus said, looking at his father in the fading light. "You or me. I told him that you were, because anyone can succeed when everything goes according to plan. The real measure of a person is how they handle it when their plans fall apart, when their dreams get derailed, when life takes them down a path they didn't choose. You did that with grace and dignity, Dad. You turned what could have been a bitter defeat into a meaningful life. That's harder and more important than anything I've accomplished." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. "We're both heroes," he said quietly. "In our own ways, for our own reasons. And we're both just ordinary men trying to do our best with what life gives us. That's all anyone can do. As the years passed, Thomas's health began to decline, his bad leg troubling him more, his energy not what it once was. But his spirit remained strong, nourished by pride in his son, love for his wife, and a deep satisfaction with the life he had lived. He continued to sit on his porch most evenings, watching the sunset, reflecting on his journey, and feeling grateful. When Thomas's time finally came, many years after that day at the palace, Marcus was granted special leave to be with his father. The old soldier passed peacefully, surrounded by family, his hand gripping Marcus's, his eyes clear and peaceful. His last words were simple. "I lived well. One loved well. I have no regrets." Marcus wore his royal guard uniform to the funeral, as did a contingent of his fellow guards who came to honor the father of one of their own. The entire village attended, and many spoke of Thomas's kindness, his wisdom, his quiet strength. The captain of the royal guard himself delivered a eulogy, speaking of how Thomas had served his country and his family with equal dedication, and how his legacy lived on through his son. They buried Thomas in the village cemetery, on a hill overlooking Millbrook, with full military honors. As the final salute was given and the flag was folded, Marcus stood at attention, tears streaming down his face, proud of his father and grateful for everything the old man had taught him. That evening, Marcus sat alone on his parents' porch, Sarah having gone inside to rest. He looked at the stars his father had loved, thought about the stories told by the fireplace, remembered the lessons learned in the backyard. He understood now, more fully than ever, that his success as a royal guard was built on a foundation his father had laid, not through pushing or pressure, but through example and love. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photograph, still carefully preserved. He looked at his father's young face, so full of hope and determination, and then turned it over to read again the message on the back. Those words, written in pain and hope 3 decades ago, had shaped both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. He would carry that photograph with him always, Marcus decided, not as a burden or a reminder of unfulfilled dreams, but as a testament to resilience, to grace, to the power of living with honor regardless of circumstances. His father had given him more than life, more than a name, more than even the inspiration to pursue his dreams. Thomas had given Marcus an example of how to be fully human, how to face disappointment with dignity, how to find meaning and purpose even when life didn't go according to plan. As the stars wheeled overhead and the familiar sounds of Millbrook surrounded him, Marcus understood that he stood guard not just at the palace gates, but over his father's legacy. Every time he put on his uniform, every time he stood his watch, every time he served with honor, he was fulfilling not just his own dreams, but continuing a tradition of service that his father had begun long ago in different circumstances. The old soldier's wish had been fulfilled, yes, but in a way far more meaningful than simply seeing his son achieve what he could not. Thomas had succeeded in passing on values that truly mattered, in raising a son who understood that honor wasn't about positions or titles, but about how you lived every single day. That was his father's true legacy, and it was more valuable than any uniform or medal could ever be. Marcus sat on that porch until the stars began to fade with the approach of dawn, thinking about his father, about his own journey, and about the generations yet to come who might sit on this same porch, looking at these same stars, and carry forward the legacy of service and honor that Thomas had embodied so well. The touching moment of pride when Marcus had fulfilled his father's wish had been real and powerful. But he understood now that it was just one moment in a much larger story of love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between fathers and sons.